What would you do if the person you trusted most became your worst enemy? Grace Miller thought she knew her husband Derek until he beat her unconscious with a baseball bat while she was pregnant. But that was just the beginning. When Derek's mistress helped forge evidence to steal Grace's baby, it seemed like evil had won. Then Grace's three powerful CEO brothers discovered the truth, and their revenge shocked everyone. This is how one woman's courage exposed a criminal conspiracy. Hit that like button if you believe justice should prevail. Subscribe because you won't want to miss how this ends. The wooden baseball bat crashed against Grace Miller's shoulder with a sickening thud. Pain exploded through her body as she stumbled backward, her hands instinctively protecting her swollen belly. She was 6 months pregnant, and the baby she carried was the only light left in her darkening world. "Please, Derek, stop," Grace whispered, her voice breaking. "You're going to hurt the baby." Derek Walsh's eyes burned with rage and alcohol. The man she had married 3 years ago, the one who had promised to love and protect her, now stood before her like a stranger. His face was twisted with hatred, his fist clenched around the bat he had grabbed from their garage. "Whose baby is it, really?" "Grace," Derek snarled, raising the bat again. "Tell me the truth for once in your lying life." Grace's heart shattered. She had never been unfaithful, never even looked at another man. She worked double shifts as an ICU nurse at Denver General Hospital to support them both while Derek struggled with his construction business. Every dollar she earned went toward their bills, their future, their family. "It's yours, Derek. It's always been yours," she sobbed, backing toward the kitchen counter. "I've never betrayed you. Never." But Derek's mind was poisoned. For months, Amber Sterling had been whispering lies in his ear at Murphy's bar downtown. The blonde bartender with her perfect smile and expensive clothes had made Derek feel important, desired. She told him that successful men like him deserved better than plain, boring wives who worked all the time. "Amber was right about you," Derek spat. "You're nothing but a manipulative liar. You trapped me with this pregnancy, but I won't be fooled anymore." The bat came down again, this time striking Grace's arm. She cried out, falling to her knees on the cold kitchen floor. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead where she had hit the cabinet. "Derek, please," she begged, crawling toward the phone on the counter. "Think about what you're doing. This is our baby, our family." Derek laughed, a cruel sound that echoed through their small ranch house in suburban Denver. "Family, you destroyed our family the day you started lying to me. Amber showed me the truth about women like you." Grace's vision blurred as she struggled to reach the phone. Her three brothers flashed through her mind. Ethan in Seattle, Jake in Chicago, Cole in Phoenix. She had been too proud to tell them about Derek's drinking, too ashamed to admit her marriage was falling apart. Now she wished she had called them months ago. Derek raised the bat one final time, and Grace closed her eyes, praying for her unborn child's safety. The sound of splintering wood filled the air as the weapon connected with the kitchen table instead of her body. When she opened her eyes, Derek was stumbling toward the door. "Sign the divorce papers," he growled. "Or next time, I won't miss." The front door slammed shut, leaving Grace alone on the floor, bleeding and broken. With trembling fingers, she managed to dial 911 before consciousness slipped away. The last thing she heard was the operator's voice asking for her location. Outside, pero a neighbor's porch light flickered on. Mrs. Henderson from next door had heard the screaming and was already on her own phone with the police. Within minutes, sirens wailed through the quiet neighborhood, but the damage was already done. Grace Miller lay unconscious on her kitchen floor, her dreams of a happy family shattered like the broken dishes scattered around her. She didn't know that this night would change everything, or that three powerful men were about to receive the phone call that would turn them into her fiercest protectors. The ambulance lights painted the walls red and blue as paramedics rushed inside. But Grace's real salvation was already boarding planes across the country. The Crawford brothers were coming home. Ethan Crawford was reviewing quarterly reports in his Seattle penthouse when his phone rang at 2:15 in the morning. As CEO of Crawford Technologies, he rarely received calls this late unless there was a major system failure. But the number on his screen made his blood run cold. "Is this Ethan Crawford?" the voice asked. "This is Nurse Johnson from Denver General Hospital. Your sister Grace Miller has been admitted to our emergency department. She's been severely injured in a domestic violence incident. The report fell from Ethan's hands, papers scattering across his mahogany desk. Grace, his baby sister, the one who had bandaged his scraped knees and cheered at his high school graduation. She had seemed so happy when she married Derek, so hopeful about their future together. "How bad is it?" Ethan asked, already reaching for his car keys. "She's stable, but she has multiple contusions, a possible concussion, and we're monitoring the baby closely." "Sir, these injuries are consistent with blunt force trauma. Someone beat her very badly." Within 20 minutes, Ethan was on his private jet bound for Denver. His first call was to Jake Crawford in Chicago, waking his middle brother from sleep in his Lakeshore Drive apartment. "Derek hurt Grace," Ethan said without preamble. "She's in the hospital. I'm flying to Denver now." Jake, a senior investment banker at Morrison Financial, felt his world tilt. Grace had always been the heart of their family, the one who kept them connected despite their busy careers and geographic distance. After their parents died in a car accident 10 years ago, the four siblings had scattered across the country, each building their own empire from nothing. "How bad?" Jake asked, already packing a bag. "Bad enough that she's in the ICU, Jake, if he hurt that baby." "I'm on the next flight out," Jake said. "Have you called Cole?" Cole Crawford, who was closing a major real estate deal in Phoenix when both his brothers called simultaneously. At 29, he was the youngest of the three men, but arguably the most volatile. His property development company had made him wealthy beyond measure, but family still came first. "I'll kill him," Cole said quietly after hearing the details. "I'll find Derek Walsh and make him pay for what he did to our sister." "We handled this smart," Ethan warned. "Grace needs us focused, not in jail for assault." By dawn, three of the most powerful men in their respective industries were gathered in the waiting room of Denver General Hospital. Ethan, with his silver hair and commanding presence, looked every inch the tech mogul he was. Jake, analytical and precise, was already reviewing Colorado's domestic violence laws on his tablet. Cole paced like a caged animal, his jaw clenched with barely controlled rage. Dr. Sarah Bennett emerged from Grace's room, her scrubs still bearing traces of blood. She had worked alongside Grace for 2 years and considered her a friend as well as a colleague. "She's awake," Dr. Bennett said. "The baby appears to be unharmed, though we're keeping her for observation. Grace has 3 cracked ribs, multiple bruises, and a mild concussion." "Gentlemen, I've seen a lot of domestic violence cases, but the pattern of injuries here suggests sustained, deliberate abuse." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. "Has this happened before?" Grace never reported anything, but looking at old x-rays, there are signs of previous trauma, healed fractures that were never properly treated. Your sister has been suffering in silence for months, possibly longer. When they entered Grace's room, the sight nearly broke their hearts. Their vibrant, caring sister looked small and fragile against the white hospital sheets. Her face was swollen, one eye blackened, her lips split, but when she saw them, she tried to smile. "You didn't have to come," Grace whispered. "I know you're all busy." Cole knelt beside her bed, tears in his eyes. "Grace, we're never too busy for you. Never." "Tell us what happened," Jake said gently. "All of it." Grace's story poured out in broken whispers. Derek's drinking, his failing business, his new friendship with Amber Sterling, the gradual escalation from verbal abuse to shoving to last night's brutal beating. She had hidden it all, too ashamed to burden her successful brothers with her problems. "He said I was lying about the baby," Grace sobbed. "He said Amber told him that women like me trap men with fake pregnancies. But this baby is everything to me. It's the only good thing left in my marriage." Ethan exchanged glances with his brothers. They had built their fortunes through intelligence, determination, and loyalty to each other. Now they would use every resource at their disposal to protect Grace and ensure Derek Walsh faced justice. "You're safe now," Ethan promised. "We're here, Infam, and we're not going anywhere until this is finished." Outside Grace's room, the three brothers made a pact. Derek Walsh had made the biggest mistake of his life when he laid hands on their sister. They would destroy him legally, financially, and socially, but they would do it the right way. Grace deserved justice, not revenge. They had no idea that Derek and Amber were already planning their next move. or that the battle ahead would test everything they believed about law, justice, and family loyalty. Derek Walsh sat in the corner booth at Murphy's bar, his hands shaking as he lifted the whiskey glass to his lips. The memory of Grace's terrified face haunted him, but Amber Sterling's reassuring voice pushed away his doubts. "You did what you had to do," Amber said, sliding into the booth beside him. Her perfectly manicured nails traced patterns on his arm as she spoke. "She was manipulating you, Derek, playing the victim to keep you trapped." Amber had been planning this moment for months. At 26, she had perfected the art of targeting vulnerable married men with money problems. Derek wasn't wealthy, but Grace's steady nursing salary and her 3 successful brothers represented opportunity. Now that Derek had finally snapped, Amber could move to phase 2 of her scheme. "But what if the baby really is mine?" Derek asked, his voice slurred with alcohol and regret. "Even if it is, do you want to be tied to her forever? Think about what we could have together. Derek, freedom, passion, a real partnership." Amber's voice dropped to a seductive whisper. "Besides, I have friends who can help us handle the legal complications." Vincent Hayes, Amber's lawyer friend, had already been briefed on the situation. He specialized in ugly divorce cases where truth mattered less than presentation. For the right price, he could make Derek look like the victim and Grace appear unstable. Meanwhile, at Denver General Hospital, the Crawford brothers were learning just how complex their sister's situation had become. Officer Tom Bradley, the investigating detective, delivered news that stunned them all. "Derek Walsh filed a restraining order this morning," Officer Bradley explained. "He claims Grace attacked him with a kitchen knife and that he was defending himself when she fell and hit her head." "That's impossible," Jake protested. "Look at her injuries. Look at the hospital reports." "I know it sounds backwards, but Walsh has a witness." A woman named Amber Sterling provided a sworn statement saying she saw Grace threaten Derek with a knife 2 weeks ago. There are also photos of alleged scratches on Derek's arms. Ethan studied the police report, his mind racing. These scratches look superficial, self-inflicted, and the timing is suspicious. Why would this Amber Sterling wait 2 weeks to report a violent incident? Officer Bradley nodded grimly. "Those are excellent questions, Mr. Crawford. Unfortunately, the judge who reviewed the restraining order request was more concerned with preventing further violence than examining evidence closely. Grace is prohibited from contacting Derek or returning to their home until the hearing next week." Cole exploded. "So the man who beat our pregnant sister gets to stay in their house while she recovers in a hospital bed? What kind of justice is that? The kind that fails victims every day," Dr. Sarah Bennett said. Entering the consultation room, "I've seen this pattern before. Abusers often file false counterclaims to muddy the waters legally. They know the system is overwhelmed and judges err on the side of caution." Grace learned about the restraining order when she woke from a pain medication-induced nap. The news hit her like another blow from Derek's bat. Not only had he beaten her, but now he was painting himself as the victim. "How can he lie like that?" Grace asked through tears. "Everyone at the hospital knows my character, my patients, my colleagues. They all know I would never hurt anyone. Character references matter in court," Jake assured her. "We'll gather statements from your coworkers, your neighbors, anyone who can testify to your true nature." But even as Jake spoke confidently, he felt uneasy. Something about this situation seemed too coordinated, too strategic for a simple domestic violence case. Derek Walsh was a construction worker with a drinking problem, not a criminal mastermind. Someone else was pulling the strings. That someone was currently celebrating in Amber's apartment across town. Vincent Hayes had just confirmed that Judge Patricia Reynolds would be hearing Grace's case. Reynolds was known for her conservative views on family preservation and her skepticism toward domestic violence claims she deemed unsubstantiated. "Perfect," Amber said, refilling Vincent's wine glass. "Judge Reynolds believes in keeping families together at all costs. With the right presentation, she'll see Grace as a hysterical woman trying to break up a marriage out of spite." Vincent smiled coldly. "I've already filed papers requesting temporary custody of the unborn child, claiming Grace is mentally unstable and poses a danger to herself and the baby. If we can get a psychological evaluation ordered, I have a therapist who owes me favors." Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The plan was spiraling beyond what he had imagined when Amber first suggested he teach Grace a lesson. Now they were talking about taking his child away from its mother. Maybe we're going too far, Derek mumbled. I just wanted her to stop controlling me, to sign the divorce papers and let me go. Amber's eyes flashed with irritation, but she quickly covered it with another seductive smile. Baby, don't you see, this is our chance for a fresh start. Once Grace is out of the picture, then we can be together properly. You'll get half of everything she owns, including whatever money her rich brothers might settle on her. The mention of money refocused Derek's attention. The Crawford brothers' wealth was legendary in Denver business circles. If he could position himself as the wrong party in this divorce, he might walk away with enough money to start over anywhere he wanted. What do I need to do? Derek asked. Vincent pulled out a thick folder. Sign these documents. They give me full authority to represent you in all legal matters related to your marriage. There's also a statement detailing Grace's alleged history of mental instability and violent behavior. Derek read through the papers, his conscience warring with his greed. The Derek Walsh who had fallen in love with Grace 3 years ago would never have signed such lies. But that man was buried under months of alcohol, resentment, and Amber's toxic influence. He signed his name with a flourish, sealing Grace's fate and his own. Back at the hospital, Grace was experiencing her first moment of hope in months. Her brothers had hired the best legal team in Colorado. Her medical colleagues were rallying around her, and public sentiment seemed to be turning in her favor. She had no idea that Derek's legal team was already 2 steps ahead, or that her next 24 hours would bring devastation beyond anything she had yet experienced. Grace stared at the legal documents in disbelief, her hands trembling as she read each carefully crafted lie. Vincent Hayes had outdone himself, weaving a narrative so twisted that it painted Derek as a devoted husband struggling with a mentally unstable wife. According to this, I've been physically abusing Derek for months, Grace said, her voice hollow. It claims I threw dishes at him, scratched his face, and threatened to kill myself if he left me. Jake reviewed the papers with his trained financial eye, looking for inconsistencies. These dates don't match hospital records. You were working double shifts on most of these alleged incidents. Work schedules can be manipulated, Ethan warned. If they have someone on the inside willing to falsify records, our evidence means nothing. Dr. Sarah Bennett knocked and entered with news that made Grace's blood run cold. Grace, I need to inform you that hospital administration received a formal complaint about your mental fitness. They're requiring a psychological evaluation before you can return to work. What? Grace struggled to sit up straighter, wincing from her healing ribs. Who filed a complaint? Vincent Hayes, representing your husband. He's claiming that your alleged domestic violence toward Derek, combined with your pregnancy hormones, makes you a danger to patients. Until you're cleared by a court-appointed psychologist, you're suspended without pay. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Without her nursing salary, Grace had no income. Derek was living in their house, using their joint bank account, while she faced mounting legal fees and medical bills. Cole paced to the window, his jaw clenched. They're trying to isolate her financially and professionally. Classic abuser tactics, but elevated to a legal strategy. There's more, Dr. Bennett continued reluctantly. Vincent Hayes has also filed for emergency custody of your unborn child. He's requesting that you be placed under psychiatric observation until delivery, with the baby going directly into Derek's custody. Grace felt the world spinning around her. The baby kicked inside her belly, as if sensing her distress. She placed both hands protectively over her stomach, tears streaming down her face. They can't take my baby, she whispered. This baby is all I have left. Ethan pulled out his phone. I'm calling our lawyers right now. This is character assassination, pure and simple. But even as Ethan dialed, he knew they were fighting an uphill battle. Derek's legal team had moved quickly and strategically, filing multiple claims simultaneously to overwhelm the system. By the time Grace's lawyers could respond to one allegation, 3 more would appear. Across town, Amber Sterling was putting the finishing touches on her masterpiece of deception. She had spent weeks creating fake social media accounts, doctoring photos, and building a digital trail that supported Derek's claims about Grace's instability. Look at this. Amber showed Vincent a series of fabricated text messages on her laptop. These show Grace threatening to hurt herself and the baby if Derek doesn't give her money for drugs. Vincent reviewed the fake evidence with professional admiration. Outstanding work. The timestamps correspond with Derek's hospital visits for his alleged injuries. When did you have time to learn digital forensics? Amber's smile was predatory. I've been practicing on other targets. Grace isn't my first mark, just my most valuable one. The truth was that Amber Sterling was not just a bartender with ambitions. She was a professional con artist who had perfected the art of destroying marriages for profit. Her real name was Amanda Stern, and she had criminal convictions in 3 states under different identities. Her method was always the same target: a vulnerable married man with assets. Seduce him away from his wife, then manipulate the legal system to maximum advantage. She had stolen houses, custody of children, and life savings from dozens of families. Grace was simply her latest victim. What about the Crawford brothers? Vincent asked. They have resources to fight back. That's why this has to be perfect, Amber replied. If we can break Grace psychologically, make her appear truly unstable, even her brothers won't be able to save her. Rich men don't like scandals attached to their families. Meanwhile, at Denver General Hospital, Grace was about to face her first devastating blow. Dr. Lisa Morrison, the court-appointed psychologist, arrived with an agenda shaped by Vincent Hayes' generous consulting fee. Mrs. Miller, I understand you've been under tremendous stress. Dr. Morrison began, her voice professionally sympathetic. I'm here to help evaluate your mental state and ensure you receive appropriate care. Grace answered honestly, describing the months of abuse, her fear for her baby's safety, and her determination to rebuild her life. But Dr. Morrison interpreted everything through the lens of Vincent's fabricated narrative. You mentioned feeling afraid constantly. Have you considered that this fear might be irrational? Perhaps stemming from pregnancy-related paranoia. The fear isn't irrational, Grace protested. My husband beat me with a baseball bat. Look at my medical records. I see that you had injuries, but trauma can sometimes cause false memories or exaggerated recollections. Have you ever experienced hallucinations or delusions? Grace felt trapped in a nightmare where up was down and truth was lies. Every honest answer was twisted into evidence of mental illness. When she mentioned Derek's drinking, Dr. Morrison suggested she was projecting her own substance abuse issues. When she described Amber's manipulation, it became proof of paranoid delusions about imaginary rivals. After 2 hours of psychological torture disguised as evaluation, Dr. Morrison had everything she needed for her predetermined conclusion. Grace Miller was suffering from pregnancy-induced psychosis, complicated by narcissistic personality traits and a history of self-harm. Based on my assessment, Dr. Morrison told Vincent Hayes later that evening, Mrs. Miller poses a significant risk to herself and her unborn child. I'm recommending immediate psychiatric intervention and supervised visitation only after delivery. Grace learned of the evaluation results when Ethan returned from an emergency legal meeting, his face grave with defeat. They're moving to have you committed to the psychiatric ward, he said quietly. The hearing is tomorrow morning, and the judge is known for following medical recommendations without question. Grace closed her eyes, feeling the last of her hope drain away. In less than 48 hours, she had lost her job, her home, her reputation, and now faced losing her freedom and her child. Maybe I should just sign whatever Derek wants, she whispered. Maybe this is what I deserve for being so stupid, so trusting. No, Cole said fiercely, taking her hand. You deserve justice, not this calculated destruction. We're going to fight this. Grace, all of it. But as Grace drifted into an exhausted sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that Derek and his accomplices were always one step ahead. She had no idea that her ordeal was about to get much worse, or that tomorrow would bring the first of 3 catastrophic events that would nearly destroy her completely. Outside her hospital room, Amber Sterling sat in a rental car, watching and waiting. Phase 3 of her plan was about to begin, and this time, there would be no recovery for Grace Miller. The courthouse steps were slick with morning rain as Grace Miller walked toward her fate, flanked by her 3 brothers and their team of lawyers. Despite everything, she had dressed carefully in a conservative navy dress that accommodated her growing belly. She wanted to look like the responsible nurse and expectant mother she was, not the unstable woman Derek's lawyers had painted her to be. Remember, Jake whispered as they climbed the courthouse steps. Stay calm. Answer only what you're asked. And don't let them provoke you into anger. Grace nodded, though her heart was racing. Today's hearing would determine whether she kept custody of her unborn child or lost everything she had left in this world. Judge Patricia Reynolds entered the courtroom with an expression that suggested she had already made up her mind. Known for her conservative views on family values, she reviewed cases quickly and rarely overturned psychiatric recommendations. Vincent Hayes stood to present Derek's case with theatrical confidence. Your Honor, we have before us a tragic situation. Derek Walsh is a hardworking man whose pregnant wife has become increasingly violent and unstable. Dr. Morrison's evaluation clearly indicates that Mrs. Miller poses a danger to herself and her unborn child. He presented the fabricated evidence with masterful skill. Photos of Derek's alleged injuries, fake text messages threatening self-harm, doctored medical records suggesting a history of mental health issues. Each lie was polished to perfection. Each forgery crafted to support the narrative of Grace as an unstable woman spiraling into dangerous delusion. Grace's lawyer, Margaret Foster, fought back with medical records, character witnesses, and documentation of Derek's drinking problem. But Vincent had anticipated every argument, providing counter-evidence that painted Grace as manipulative and vindictive. Mrs. Miller has clearly coached her colleagues at the hospital, Vincent argued. These character witnesses are financially dependent on her good opinion and cannot be considered objective. The hearing's turning point came when Dr. Morrison took the stand. Her testimony was devastating in its clinical precision. Mrs. Miller exhibits classic signs of pregnancy-induced psychosis, complicated by narcissistic traits and possible substance abuse, Dr. Morrison stated with false authority. She becomes agitated when confronted with reality, shows paranoid ideation regarding her husband's female friends, and has expressed suicidal thoughts related to losing custody. Grace watched in horror as her own words were twisted beyond recognition. Her honest admission of feeling scared became evidence of paranoia. Her tears over potentially losing her baby became proof of unstable emotional regulation. Judge Reynolds listened with growing concern, occasionally glancing at Grace with what appeared to be pity mixed with suspicion. Mr. Hay, the judge said, what safeguards are you proposing to protect this unborn child? Your Honor, we request immediate placement in psychiatric care for Mrs. Miller, with supervised visitation rights only after successful completion of treatment. Upon delivery, temporary custody should be granted to Mr. Walsh, who has demonstrated stability and concern for his child's welfare. Judge Reynolds barely deliberated. Given the psychiatric evaluation and the evidence presented, I find that Mrs. Miller poses a substantial risk to her unborn child. Effective immediately. She will be placed under psychiatric observation at Denver State Hospital. Upon delivery, temporary custody of the child will be awarded to Derek Walsh pending further evaluation. Grace felt the world collapse around her. The gavel's echoes seemed to reverberate through her bones as bailiffs approached to escort her to the psychiatric facility. Her brothers reached for her, but court security held them back. This is wrong, Ethan shouted, his composure finally cracking. You're condemning an innocent woman based on lies. But Judge Reynolds had already moved on to the next case. Grace was led away in shackles, her freedom stripped away by a corrupt system manipulated by master criminals. While Grace was being processed into the psychiatric ward, Derek and Vincent were executing the second phase of their plan, using power of attorney documents that Derek had signed months earlier during a drunken evening with Amber. Vincent began systematically draining Grace's assets. The joint bank accounts were emptied first. $15,000 that Grace had saved for the baby's future disappeared into accounts controlled by Derek. Her retirement fund from the hospital was liquidated early, with penalties and taxes eating into the remaining balance. But the most devastating blow was yet to come. Vincent had discovered that Grace's house, purchased before her marriage, could be legally transferred to Derek under Colorado's community property laws if they could prove she was mentally incompetent. Jake Crawford received the call while frantically trying to arrange bail for Grace's release from psychiatric hold. They've taken everything, the family's lawyer reported grimly. Derek filed claims against all marital assets, citing Grace's psychiatric commitment as evidence of incompetence. The house is in foreclosure proceedings, and he's liquidated every account they shared. How is that legal? Cole demanded. Colorado law allows spouses broad access to marital assets. especially when one party is declared mentally unfit. Vincent Hayes has been planning this for months, getting Derek to sign documents that give him complete financial control. Grace learned of her financial ruin during a forced psychiatric evaluation at Denver State Hospital. The sterile white room felt like a prison as Dr. Janet Reeves, another psychologist in Vincent's network, delivered the news. Mrs. Miller, your husband has informed us that you've been financially irresponsible, hiding money and making unauthorized purchases. As part of your treatment, we need to address these compulsive behaviors. What unauthorized purchases? Grace asked, confused and medicated from the psychiatric drugs they had forced her to take. According to the financial records, you've been spending large amounts on alcohol and mysterious cash withdrawals. This supports our diagnosis of substance abuse, contributing to your mental deterioration. Grace stared at the fabricated bank statements in disbelief. Every withdrawal shown was actually Derek's drinking money. Every suspicious purchase was his gambling debt. But the psychiatric drugs made it difficult to think clearly, to formulate arguments against the lies. The stress of losing custody and facing financial ruin triggered Grace's worst fear. That night in the psychiatric ward, she began experiencing severe abdominal cramping. The baby, responding to her mother's extreme distress, went into premature labor at 32 weeks. "Help me," Grace called to the night nurse, clutching her belly as contractions began. "Something's wrong with the baby." But the psychiatric ward was understaffed, and the on-duty nurse dismissed Grace's concerns as attention-seeking behavior typical of her diagnosed condition. "Mrs. Miller, you're experiencing anxiety, not labor. Return to your bed and take your medication." For 3 agonizing hours, Grace labored alone in her locked room while staff ignored her cries for help. By the time a competent medical professional arrived, it was almost too late. Dr. Sarah Bennett, who had been frantically calling the psychiatric facility, finally convinced them to transfer Grace to the maternity ward. What she found horrified her. "This woman has been in active labor for hours," Dr. Bennett shouted at the psychiatric staff. "How could you ignore obvious medical distress? Baby Emma Crawford Miller was born at 32 weeks, weighing only 3 pounds and requiring immediate intensive care." As Grace held her tiny daughter for the first precious minutes before the NICU team took over, she felt both overwhelming love and devastating fear. "She's so small," Grace whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Will she be okay?" Dr. Bennett checked the baby's vital signs, her expression carefully controlled. "She's fighting, Grace, but premature babies face serious complications. The next 72 hours will be critical." The irony was crushing. Grace was a trained ICU nurse who had saved countless lives, but she was powerless to help her own daughter. Shackled to a hospital bed under psychiatric guard, she could only watch through glass as her baby fought for life in an incubator. Derek arrived at the hospital with Vincent Hayes and legal documents granting him immediate custody. He looked uncomfortable as he stared at his tiny daughter through the NICU window, but Amber's coaching had prepared him for this moment. "The baby needs stability," Derek announced to the gathered medical staff. "I'm taking her home as soon as she's medically cleared." "That child needs her mother to tamba," Dr. Bennett protested. "Grace is an experienced nurse who can provide the specialized care a premature baby requires." Vincent smiled coldly. "Mrs. Miller is a psychiatric patient whose mental state contributed to this premature delivery. The court has determined that she's unfit for custody." Grace watched helplessly as strangers made decisions about her daughter's future. In the span of 72 hours, she had lost her freedom, her financial security, and now potentially her child's life hung in the balance. But even in her darkest moment, Grace didn't know that her brothers were mounting a desperate counterattack, or that Amber Sterling's greed was about to expose the entire conspiracy. The final battle for Grace's redemption was about to begin, triggered by one person's conscience and 3 brothers' unshakable loyalty. Rebecca Stone had worked as Vincent Hayes' legal assistant for 3 years, witnessing ethically questionable behavior that finally cracked her professional facade when watching Grace Miller's systematic destruction. Rebecca sat in her apartment, staring at files she had secretly copied from Vincent's office. The evidence was overwhelming: forged documents, bribed witnesses, fabricated psychiatric evaluations. Vincent hadn't just bent the rules, he had shattered them completely. The tipping point came when Rebecca discovered Amber Sterling's real identity. A simple background check revealed Amanda Stern's criminal history across 3 states: fraud, identity theft, extortion. Vincent knew exactly who his client was. "I can't be part of this anymore," Rebecca whispered, picking up her phone to call the Colorado Bar Association's ethics hotline. Meanwhile, at Denver State Hospital, Grace was experiencing her first glimmer of hope in days. Dr. Bennett had managed to get her transferred to the maternity ward, closer to baby Emma in the NICU. "Her lung development is progressing well," Dr. Bennett reported during morning rounds. "If she continues improving, we might be able to remove the ventilator by next week." Grace pressed her face against the NICU window, watching her daughter's tiny chest rise and fall, even at 3 pounds. Emma was a fighter, her little fists clenched with determination. "She looks like you," Cole observed, standing beside his sister. He had been camping at the hospital for days, refusing to leave Grace's side. "She has Derek's chin," Grace said sadly. "I hope she doesn't inherit his capacity for cruelty." "She'll inherit your strength," Ethan assured her, entering with Jake and their legal team. "Speaking of which, we have good news." Margaret Foster, their lead attorney, pulled out a thick folder. "We've found inconsistencies in Vincent Hayes' evidence. The digital forensics expert we hired discovered that those text messages were created using software, not sent from your phone." Grace felt her heart skip. "You mean you can prove they're fake?" "That's just the beginning," Jake added. "Our private investigator traced Amber Sterling's real identity. Her name is Amanda Stern, and she's wanted in Nevada for similar fraud schemes." For the first time in weeks, Grace dared to hope. Her brother's resources and determination were finally paying off. Vincent's seemingly perfect case was beginning to unravel. "What does this mean for Emma?" Grace asked, touching the glass separating her from her daughter. "If we can prove fraud and conspiracy, the original custody order becomes void," Margaret explained. "Derek's claims were based on falsified evidence." Grace allowed herself to imagine bringing Emma home, raising her daughter in safety and love. The psychiatric hold would be lifted, her nursing license restored. "Emergency hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning," Ethan replied. But Derek and Amber were finalizing their most devastating counterattack. Vincent Hayes had warned them that their carefully constructed lies were under legal assault. "They're getting too close," Vincent told Amber during an emergency meeting. "The digital forensics evidence could expose everything." Amber's eyes glittered with malicious intelligence. "Then we need to discredit their experts before they can testify." "What about Rebecca? I think she's been copying files from my office." "Rebecca Stone will be handled," Amber said with chilling calm. The next morning brought devastating news for Grace's case. Margaret Foster received a call at 6 a.m. informing her that their digital forensics expert had been killed in a car accident. All evidence had been destroyed in the resulting fire. "This can't be a coincidence," Ethan said grimly. "They're eliminating witnesses." "Rebecca Stone is also missing," Jake reported. Her apartment shows signs of a struggle. Grace felt her newfound hope crumbling. Without the digital evidence and Rebecca's testimony, they had no way to prove Vincent's conspiracy. "We're back to square one," Grace said, tears flowing freely. But Grace didn't know that Rebecca Stone was alive, hidden in FBI protection. Her call to the Colorado Bar Association had triggered a federal investigation into Vincent Hayes' practice. The emergency hearing proceeded as Vincent had planned. He presented new allegations that Grace had conspired to fabricate evidence, portraying her as a desperate woman willing to commit crimes. "Your Honor, Sam," Vincent argued, "Mrs. Miller's family hired hackers to create false evidence. When their conspiracy was discovered, they eliminated witnesses to cover their tracks." Judge Reynolds listened with growing anger, believing she had been manipulated by a wealthy family trying to buy justice. "Mr. Crawford," Judge Reynolds addressed Ethan directly, "these are serious allegations. Did your family attempt to manufacture evidence?" "Absolutely not, Your Honor," Ethan replied firmly. "Experts who conveniently died before cross-examination." Vincent interjected. "How convenient for the Crawford family." Judge Reynolds made her decision swiftly. "Given these allegations and suspicious circumstances, I am extending Mrs. Miller's psychiatric commitment indefinitely. Furthermore, I am ordering a federal investigation into possible obstruction of justice by the Crawford family." Grace watched her world collapse again. Not only was she losing Emma permanently, but now her brothers faced criminal investigation. "I'm so sorry," Grace whispered to Ethan. "I've destroyed all of your lives." But Ethan squeezed her hand with unshakable resolve. "This isn't over, Grace. They've made it personal." As Grace was led away in shackles, she had no idea that the FBI was already building a case that would bring down Vincent Hayes' entire operation. Derek watched the proceedings with growing unease. Somewhere in his alcohol-soaked conscience, he still remembered loving Grace. Seeing her broken, stirred feelings, he thought Amber had destroyed. That night, Derek made a decision that would change everything. He was going to visit his daughter in the NICU, and for the first time in months, he was going to think clearly about what he had done. Derek Walsh stood alone in the NICU at 3 in the morning, staring at his daughter through the glass incubator. Baby Emma was off the ventilator now, breathing on her own, her tiny fists opening and closing as she slept. For the first time in months, Derek was completely sober. The silence gave him space to think without Amber's constant manipulation. He remembered the day Grace told him she was pregnant, how her face had glowed with joy. He remembered her working double shifts to support his failing construction business, never complaining, always believing in him. "What have I done?" Derek whispered, pressing his palm against the cool glass. A nurse approached quietly. "Are you the father?" Derek nodded, unable to speak. "She's a fighter, just like her mama. Grace talks to her every day through the window. That little girl knows her mother's voice already." Derek's heart clenched. Grace was shackled in a psychiatric ward while their daughter fought for life, and he was responsible for all of it. Amber's lies had seemed so convincing when he was drunk and angry, but now they crumbled under reality's weight. Derek walked to the hospital chapel, where Father Miguel Rodriguez had been chaplain for 20 years. Derek's confession shook him to his core. "I helped them destroy my wife," Derek sobbed, kneeling in the front pew. "Grace never hurt me, never hurt anyone. She's the kindest person I've ever known, and I let them convince me she was evil." "Son, why did you participate in these lies?" Father Rodriguez asked gently. "I was angry, drunk, jealous of her success. Amber made me feel important, made me believe Grace was holding me back. But seeing my daughter tonight, knowing Grace might never get to raise her because of my lies, I can't live with this anymore." "What are you going to do about it?" Derek looked up, his eyes red but determined. "I'm going to tell the truth, all of it." The next morning, Rebecca Stone emerged from FBI protection with devastating evidence against Vincent Hayes' criminal empire. Agent Sarah Mitchell had been investigating Hayes for months, following a trail of destroyed families across 3 states. Rebecca Stone has provided extensive documentation of a conspiracy to defraud the Colorado court system, Agent Mitchell announced at a press conference. "We have evidence of forged documents, bribed witnesses, and systematic corruption involving attorney Vincent Hayes and his associate Amanda Stern." Derek Walsh walked into the FBI field office at 10 a.m., accompanied by Father Rodriguez and a legal aid attorney. His hands shook as he signed the sworn statement detailing Amber's manipulation and Vincent's criminal conspiracy. "Grace Miller is innocent of every charge against her," Derek stated on video. "I lied about the domestic violence. Amber Sterling coached me to fabricate injuries and create false evidence. My wife never hurt me or threatened our child. She's been a victim of my cruelty and their fraud." Derek's confession triggered immediate federal action. Marshals arrested Vincent Hayes at his law office while he prepared for Derek's scheduled media appearances. Amber Sterling was taken into custody at her apartment, where FBI agents found document forgery equipment and detailed files on other victims. Grace learned of the arrest while feeding Emma her first bottle in the NICU. Dr. Bennett delivered the news with tears in her eyes. Derek confessed everything to the FBI. Dr. Bennett said, "The charges against you are being dropped, and an emergency hearing is scheduled to restore your custody rights." Grace nearly dropped the bottle, her hands trembling with shock and relief. "You mean it's over, Emma, and I can go home?" "Judge Reynolds is in federal custody herself," Dr. Bennett continued. "The FBI investigation revealed she was taking bribes to rule in Vincent's favor. A new judge will review your case this afternoon." For the first time in weeks, Grace allowed herself to cry tears of joy instead of despair. Emma gurgled contentedly in her arms, unaware that her world had just shifted from darkness to light. The hearing that afternoon was unlike anything Grace had experienced. Judge Michael Harrison, brought in from Colorado Springs to ensure impartiality, reviewed the FBI evidence with visible disgust. This court has been systematically deceived by criminal actors, Judge Harrison stated. Mrs. Miller, you have been the victim of an elaborate fraud designed to destroy your life and steal your child. Derek sat in the defendant's section, no longer represented by Vincent Hayes. When called to testify, he looked directly at Grace for the first time in months. I want to apologize to my wife, Derek said, his voice breaking. Grace Miller is an extraordinary woman who deserved better than my weakness and jealousy. She never hurt me, never hurt anyone. She poured her heart into our marriage while I let another woman poison my mind with lies. Judge Harrison's final ruling was swift and decisive. Full custody of Emma Miller is restored to her mother, Grace Miller. All previous psychiatric evaluations are deemed fraudulent and stricken from the record. Mrs. Miller's professional licenses are immediately reinstated. Grace held Emma close as the gavel fell, officially ending the nightmare that had nearly destroyed them both. Her brothers surrounded her with fierce embraces. Their 3-month battle finally won. As Grace walked out of the courthouse with Emma in her arms, reporters shouted questions about her ordeal. But Grace had only one statement. My daughter and I are survivors. We're going home to build a life filled with love, truth, and hope. The Crawford brothers had proven that family loyalty could overcome even the most sophisticated criminal conspiracy. Grace had proven that truth, no matter how buried, eventually finds its way to light. The federal courthouse in Denver was packed with media as the trials of Vincent Hayes and Amanda Stern began. Grace Miller sat in the front row, holding 6-month-old Emma, who had grown strong and healthy despite her premature birth. The sight of her daughter's bright eyes gave Grace strength for her most difficult testimony yet. The prosecution calls Grace Miller to the stand, announced Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, who had built her career prosecuting white-collar criminals targeting vulnerable families. Grace approached the witness stand with quiet dignity, wearing a simple blue dress that reminded everyone of the nurse and mother she was, not the mentally unstable woman Vincent Hayes had portrayed. Mrs. Miller, Attorney Walsh began gently, please tell the jury about your life before you met Derek Walsh. Grace's voice was steady as she described her childhood, education, and career as an ICU nurse. She painted a picture of a woman dedicated to helping others, someone who had never been arrested, never had mental health issues, never shown signs of the instability Derek's legal team had alleged. When did you first notice changes in your husband's behavior? About 8 months before the assault, Grace replied. Derek started drinking heavily and staying out late. He became critical of everything I did, accusing me of thinking I was better than him. Vincent Hayes, representing himself after his legal team abandoned him, objected repeatedly during Grace's testimony, but his interruptions only made him look more desperate. Mrs. Miller, Vincent said during cross-examination, isn't it true that you fabricated this entire story to gain sympathy? Grace looked directly at him, unafraid. Mr. Ices, you know that's not true. You have seen the FBI evidence proving that you and Amanda Stern systematically created false documentation to destroy my life. Amanda Stern's trial was even more dramatic. The FBI had uncovered evidence of her crimes across multiple states, revealing a pattern of targeting vulnerable married men and destroying families for financial gain. Detective Lisa Rodriguez testified about the scope of Amanda's criminal enterprise. We've identified at least 12 families that Amanda Stern victimized using various identities. Her method was always the same: seduce a married man with financial problems, manipulate him into believing his wife was unfaithful, then use falsified evidence to gain control of marital assets. The most damaging testimony came from Rebecca Stone, whose courage in coming forward had exposed the entire conspiracy. Amanda bragged about her success rate. Rebecca testified. She said Grace Miller was going to be her biggest score because the Crawford brothers were worth millions. Derek Walsh's testimony was the most emotionally charged moment of both trials. Sober for the first time in over a year and enrolled in court-mandated treatment, he looked like a different man. I want to take full responsibility for my actions, Derek said, his voice thick with emotion. Grace Miller never hurt me, never threatened me, never gave me any reason to doubt her loyalty. I was angry about my own failures, and Amanda Stern exploited that anger to destroy my family. Mr. Walsh, Attorney Walsh asked, why did you finally decide to tell the truth? Derek looked directly at Grace, who sat holding Emma in the gallery. I saw my daughter in the hospital, fighting for her life because of the stress I had caused her mother. I realized that Grace was the strongest person I knew, and I had tried to destroy her because of my own weakness. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Vincent Hayes was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Amanda Stern received 20 years due to her extensive criminal history. Judge Patricia Reynolds received 8 years for accepting bribes. Derek Walsh, whose cooperation had been crucial to the prosecution, was sentenced to 5 years with possibility of parole in 3. After the sentencing, Grace stood on the courthouse steps with Emma in her arms, surrounded by her 3 brothers and supporters who had followed her story. Justice has been served, Grace said to the assembled reporters. But this case is about more than punishing criminals. It's about reforming a system that failed to protect a victim of domestic violence. Grace's ordeal had sparked legislative action across Colorado. New laws required independent verification of psychiatric evaluations in custody cases and stricter oversight of attorney conduct in family court proceedings. The Crawford brothers had established the Emma Miller Foundation, providing legal assistance and financial support to domestic violence victims facing fraudulent legal challenges. Grace returned to her position at Denver General Hospital, where her colleagues welcomed her back as a hero. Her experience had made her an even better nurse, someone who could connect with patients facing seemingly impossible challenges. 6 months after the trials ended, Grace received an unexpected visitor. Derek had been released on work furlough and asked to meet with her to discuss Emma's future. They met at a family mediation center, with social workers present to ensure safety. Derek looked healthier than he had in years, sober and attending therapy regularly. I don't expect forgiveness, Derek said quietly. I know what I did was unforgivable, but I want Emma to know that I love her, even though I failed her completely. Grace studied the man she had once loved, seeing glimpses of the person she had married buried under layers of regret. Emma will know her father, Grace said finally, but supervised visits only, and you continue treatment. 1 drink, 1 missed therapy session, 1 moment of dishonesty, and you lose that privilege forever. Derek nodded gratefully. I understand. Thank you for giving me any chance at all. As Grace drove home that evening with Emma babbling happily in her car seat, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The woman who had been beaten unconscious on her kitchen floor had emerged stronger and more determined than ever. Emma would grow up knowing her mother's strength, protected by uncles who would move mountains for family, surrounded by a community that had learned to fight for justice rather than accept corruption. Grace Miller had faced the worst that human cruelty could devise and had emerged victorious, not through revenge, but through truth, courage, and the unshakable bonds of family love. 2 years had passed since the trials that brought down Vincent Hayes and Amanda Stern. Grace Miller stood in the nursery of her new home, watching 18-month-old Emma take her first tentative steps between the couch and coffee table. The little girl's laughter filled the room as she tumbled safely into Grace's waiting arms. Mama. Emma giggled, her vocabulary growing daily. Grace marveled at her daughter's resilience. Despite her traumatic start in life, Emma had developed into a bright, happy toddler who seemed to inherit her mother's strength and her uncle's determination. The house Grace had bought with money from the civil lawsuit against Vincent Hayes and Amanda Stern was modest but filled with light. Large windows overlooked a garden where Grace grew vegetables and flowers, finding peace in nurturing life after so much destruction. How's my favorite niece today? Cole asked, entering the nursery with his usual energy. At 31, he remained the most volatile of the Crawford brothers, but Emma had softened his edges considerably. Uncle Cole, Emma squealed, reaching for him with chubby arms. Cole scooped her up easily, spinning her around until she shrieked with delight. Ready for the park, Uncle Ethan and Uncle Jake are meeting us there with the new swings they bought. Grace smiled, watching her daughter's face light up at the mention of her uncles. The Crawford brothers had stepped into Emma's life as devoted father figures, each bringing their own special relationship with their niece. Ethan, the tech mogul, was teaching Emma about computers and gadgets despite her young age. Jake, The financial expert had set up a college fund that would ensure Emma's education regardless of what the future held. Cole, the real estate developer, was building a playground in the backyard that would be the envy of every child in the neighborhood. Actually, Grace said, I need to make a stop first. Derek asked to see Emma today. Cole's expression tightened. Despite Derek's cooperation with the prosecution and his ongoing sobriety, Cole still struggled to forgive the man who had nearly destroyed his sister. You sure about this? Cole asked carefully. Grace nodded. He's been sober for 2 years. He's completed anger management and therapy. And Emma deserves to know her father. He can't hurt us anymore. Cole. The supervised visitation center was a bright, cheerful place designed to help families reconnect in a safe environment. Derek was already waiting when Grace arrived with Emma, his face lighting up when he saw his daughter. Hey, sweetheart, Derek said softly, kneeling to Emma's level. Do you remember Daddy? Emma studied Derek's face solemnly, then reached out to touch his cheek. Daddy's sad. Derek's eyes filled with tears. Even at 18 months, Emma seemed to sense the weight of sorrow he carried. Daddy is sad sometimes, but seeing you makes me happy. Grace watched the interaction carefully, noting Derek's gentle movements and patient demeanor. Sobriety and therapy had restored much of the man she had once loved, though she could never trust him with her heart again. How's the construction business? Grace asked as Emma played with blocks Derek had broken. Good, Derek replied. I'm specializing in domestic violence shelters now. The work feels important, like maybe I can help rebuild something after everything I destroyed. It was a small step toward redemption, but Grace recognized the significance. Derek was using his construction skills to create safe spaces for women like the person she had been 2 years ago. Emma's starting preschool in the fall, Grace mentioned. She'll be in the program at Denver General's daycare center. Derek smiled. She's going to be brilliant, just like her mother. Grace, I want you to know that I think about what I did every day. Not just the physical harm, but the betrayal, the lies, the way I let them manipulate our love into something ugly. Grace watched Emma stack blocks with determined concentration. Therapy helped me understand that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. Derek, it's about choosing not to let the past control our future. Umma needs a father who's honest about his mistakes but committed to being better. After the visit, Grace drove to Denver General Hospital for her shift as the new director of patient advocacy. Her experience with the legal system had made her an effective advocate for patients facing their own battles with insurance companies, family conflicts, and medical complications. Dr. Sarah Bennett met her in the corridor with a familiar smile. How did the visit go? Better each time, Grace replied. Derek's genuinely trying to change, and Emma enjoys seeing him. I think we're finding our way to a healthy co-parenting relationship. That's remarkable. Considering everything that happened, Grace paused outside her office, looking through the window at the Denver skyline. I learned that healing doesn't mean pretending trauma never happened. It means choosing hope over bitterness, truth over revenge, and love over fear. That evening, Grace sat in her garden while Emma napped, working on the memoir she was writing about her experience. The book, tentatively titled Fighting for Truth, would be published next year with proceeds going to the Emma Miller Foundation. Her phone rang, and Grace smiled when she saw the caller ID. Rebecca Stone had become an unexpected friend, their shared experience of surviving Vincent Hayes' conspiracy creating a deep bond. How's the new job? Grace asked. Rebecca laughed. Busy. The FBI's white-collar crime unit keeps me running, but it feels good to help catch criminals instead of enabling them. Any word on Amanda's appeal? Denied, Rebecca said with satisfaction. She'll serve the full 20 years. Vincent's appeal was denied too. The federal judges weren't impressed with their claims of prosecutorial misconduct. Grace felt relief rather than satisfaction. Justice had been served. But more importantly, other families were now protected from Amanda's predatory schemes. I have some news, Rebecca continued. The Colorado legislature passed the Grace Miller Act yesterday. It requires independent oversight of all custody evaluations and creates penalties for attorneys who knowingly present fabricated evidence. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Her suffering had created meaningful change that would protect other families facing similar fraud. Thank you for everything you did to make that possible. Rebecca. Thank you for having the courage to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless. After ending the call, Grace returned to her writing, documenting the darkest period of her life with the perspective that only survival could provide. The woman who had been beaten unconscious on her kitchen floor 2 years ago had emerged as an advocate, author, and inspiration to others facing seemingly impossible circumstances. Emma's first steps that morning had been another milestone in their journey of healing. Each day brought new moments of joy that overshadowed the memories of trauma. Grace was building a life defined not by what had been done to her, but by what she chose to do with her second chance. As the sun set over Denver, casting golden light across Grace's garden, she felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this peaceful moment. The battles had been worth fighting, the pain had led to purpose, and the love of family had proven stronger than any conspiracy designed to destroy it. Emma stirred from her nap, calling for her mother with the complete trust that only children possess. Grace went to her own daughter, lifting her into arms that would always protect, always love, always fight for the truth. Their story was far from over, but the foundation was strong, built on honesty, secured by justice, and surrounded by the unbreakable bonds of family love. 5 years after the night that changed everything, Grace Miller stood at the podium of the Colorado State Capitol, addressing a joint session of the legislature. Emma, now 6 years old and in first grade, sat in the gallery with her three uncles, watching her mother with quiet pride. "Honored legislators," Grace began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived the unthinkable. "I stand before you today not as a victim, but as a voice for the countless families who face corruption, fraud, and violence in what should be our most trusted institutions." The Grace Miller Act had been just the beginning. Over the past 5 years, Grace's advocacy work had led to comprehensive reforms in family court procedures, domestic violence response protocols, and attorney oversight mechanisms. Her memoir, Fighting for Truth, had become a bestseller that inspired legislative action in 12 states. The Emma Miller Foundation has assisted over 300 families facing fraudulent legal challenges. Grace continued, "We've helped expose corrupt attorneys, supported victims of domestic violence, and ensured that wealth and influence cannot overcome truth and justice." In the gallery, Ethan Crawford watched his sister with immense pride. His technology company had developed new software for document authentication, now used in courts nationwide. Jake Crawford had established a legal defense fund, providing expert testimony for families who couldn't afford to fight sophisticated fraud schemes. Cole Crawford's construction company had built 17 domestic violence shelters in 4 states. But the Crawford brothers' greatest achievement was simply being present for Emma and Grace, creating a family structure built on love, trust, and unwavering support. After the legislative session, Grace drove to Emma's school for the annual father-daughter dance. It had become their tradition that one of her uncles would escort Emma, rotating each year to ensure all three men remained equally involved in her life. This year was Cole's turn, arriving dressed in a tuxedo that made Emma gasp with delight. "Uncle Cole, you look like a prince," Emma exclaimed, twirling in her pink dress. "Not half as beautiful as you, princess," Cole replied, bowing dramatically. "Shall we go show all those other dads how it's done?" Grace watched them leave, her heart full of gratitude for the men who had stepped up to fill the gaps in Emma's life. Derek remained part of Emma's world through supervised visits, but the Crawford brothers were her daily reality, her security, her example of what good men looked like. Dr. Sarah Bennett stopped by later that evening, as she often did when Grace needed to decompress after public appearances. "How did the speech go?" Sarah asked, settling into Grace's kitchen with tea. "Good, I think. Sometimes I still can't believe people want to hear my story." Sarah smiled. "Grace, you've become one of the most effective advocates for judicial reform in the country. Your story gives hope to people who think the system is too powerful to fight." "I got a call from Derek yesterday," Grace mentioned quietly. "He wanted to thank me for letting him be part of Emma's life. He's getting married next month to a woman he met in therapy. She's a social worker who specializes in domestic violence counseling. How do you feel about that?" Grace considered the question. "Happy for him? Honestly, Derek's worked hard to become a better person, and Emma deserves to see her father in a healthy relationship. It validates the choice to forgive him." Emma burst through the front door at 9 p.m., her cheeks flushed with excitement and her hair slightly disheveled from dancing. Mama, Uncle Cole taught me the waltz and the cha-cha, and we had ice cream, and everyone said I was the best dancer there. Grace hugged her daughter, breathing in the scent of childhood joy and innocence. Emma's life was filled with love, security, and countless adults who would protect her from trauma. Did you thank Uncle Cole for taking you? 3 times, Emma announced proudly. And I told him I love him bigger than the whole universe. As Emma got ready for bed, Grace reflected on the evening's perfect normalcy. There had been a time when she feared Emma would grow up damaged by trauma, but instead her daughter was thriving in an environment of love and support. Mama, Emma said as Grace tucked her into bed, why do people sometimes hurt the people they're supposed to love? It was the question Grace had been dreading and expecting for years. Emma was old enough to ask hard questions about her father's actions and her family's complicated history. Sometimes people hurt the ones they love because they're hurt inside themselves. Grace explained carefully. Your daddy was hurt and confused when you were a baby, and he made very bad choices, but he's working hard to be better now. Like when I'm mean to my friends because I'm tired. Similar, but much more serious. The important thing is that when we make mistakes, we have to work hard to fix them and make sure we don't hurt people again. Emma considered this gravely. I'm glad Daddy is trying to be better, and I'm glad we have Uncle Ethan and Uncle Jake and Uncle Cole to keep us safe. Grace kissed her daughter's forehead, marveling at the child's capacity for understanding and forgiveness. Emma was growing up with sophisticated understanding of human complexity that would serve her well throughout life. Later that night, Grace sat in her home office, working on the outline for her second book. This one would focus on healing and rebuilding after trauma, offering practical guidance for survivors ready to reclaim their lives. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. Proud of you today. Dad and Mom would be amazed to see what you've accomplished. Grace smiled, thinking of her parents who had died when Emma was just an infant. They would have loved their granddaughter fiercely and would have been proud of the family their children had built together. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate had taken 5 years, but every step had been worth it. Grace Miller had faced systematic destruction and emerged stronger, using her experience to protect others and reform the systems that had failed her. Emma's laughter echoed from her bedroom as she played with her dolls, creating elaborate stories of adventure and friendship. The little girl who had begun life fighting for breath in a NICU was now a confident first grader who believed in justice, truth, and the power of family love. Grace closed her laptop and prepared for bed, grateful for the peaceful life they had built from the ashes of betrayal and fraud. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to advocate for families in crisis, and new moments of joy with the daughter who had given her the strength to fight when everything seemed hopeless. The house settled into quiet contentment as Denver slept around them. Mother and daughter, protected by uncles who would move mountains for their safety, surrounded by a community that had learned to fight for justice rather than accept corruption. Grace Miller's story had become larger than her own survival. It was proof that truth, courage, and family love could overcome even the most sophisticated criminal conspiracy. Her voice would continue to inspire others. Her advocacy would protect future families. And her daughter would grow up knowing that heroes aren't born. They're forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the choice to help others. The nightmare that began with Derek's betrayal had transformed into a life of purpose, meaning, and hope. The most powerful victories come not from revenge, but from forgiveness, healing, and the determination to turn suffering into service for others.